Here's a hand-drawn plan. Is it possible to render this in Morpholio Trace without actually having to redraw it, to simply import this directly into Morpholio and start rendering straight away? Well, yes it is, and I'll show you how. Well, the first thing we need to do is to take a photograph of this drawing from above using our iPhone, trying to square it as neatly as possible to the vertical and horizontal axes. So a photograph like this, again just taken on my iPhone, will work very well. We can crop it, and then once cropped, drop it straight into Morpholio. Well, here's the iPhone photograph of that hand-drawn plan. Now brought into Morpholio, it's simply come in as a JPEG, a direct import from the photos here on the right, and you can see that it still looks exactly the same as the original. So I'm now good to go, apart from the fact that I only need to scale it. There's a scale bar here running from 0 to 5 meters, and so I scale the drawing by simply inputting the scale here, zooming in on that, checking that I've aligned carefully at that point, and likewise here. And now I can enter the number 5, tick and tick again. The scale has now registered. Always check that the scale is properly registered, and yes it is. It's all working and all lined up. So yes, we're good to go. I'm going to start by planting some trees. I'm going to plant trees in a separate layer from this underlying photograph of the garden, which I'm going to leave exactly as it is. So I'm not going to touch this original hand-drawn drawing, which was done with pen and paper on a real piece of paper. Planting trees. I'm in a separate layer, stencils. From stencils I've got a tree. This is a tree which I drew earlier and created this stencil, which is a very easy process in Morpholio. And I now simply want to place a tree here and plant it by touching the ink here as an instant infill, and you can see that I've got a tree positioned in the garden exactly where it's meant to go at that point. I want a couple of other trees as well, and the easiest way to position those is actually to copy and paste rather than re-stenciling. So I'll just copy that, and then I can very easily move it to another position here in this bed, but this one needs to be considerably smaller, and so it will sit like that. And there's another tree which is going to sit over here, and that one again needs to be slightly smaller, so a small ornamental tree which is just going in that bed there. So we now have those 3 trees planted. What I now want to do is add some grasses to this. There's a bed running around here, and so with another layer of tracing, to keep the planting controllable and to keep it separate, we just make this paper fully opaque, and I'll choose another stencil. So this time I'll choose another stencil of mine from my own collection here, and so this is one which I drew previously, so I can plant these grasses around this bed. I can position that stencil there, and you can see that they fill this bed very quickly. We can rotate them slightly and slightly change the size of the stencils as we go, because it makes them look less overtly cloned. I just brought those, inadvertently touched the screen, so rubbed out my stencils I was going by mistake. But you can see that we've now filled those beds like so. I come out of that stencil. We can then add some foliage here, generic planting around this water bowl. I'm now going to select a folia stencil, which I produced earlier, which just gives a generic feel for foliage. And to really achieve this, I'm going to use a crayon and stencil, as the name implies, into this stencil to produce a much more hand-rendered look. And I'm changing the colours here as well, because that again will give a better impression of mixed foliage. Add a little bit of black as well. And then when we come out of this, you can see that what I've produced here, if we just switch the stencil off for a minute, you can see this gives a general feel for generic foliage. We don't have to go on using the stencil. We can then copy and paste, just as I was doing for the trees before. So I copy that, copy, swing round, and readjust the position. I'm then going to copy, swing round and readjust the position. And then maybe a little bit more stenciling here, but we can come to that because what I've got here is something that goes around this water bowl, but of course I want to delete everything that's overlapping the water bowl, and the easiest way to work is to always draw too much and then erase what you don't need. It's a very quick way of working where I've made rather a mess of the foliage here, but as soon as I erase what I don't want to see, you can actually see it comes out looking actually like quite a clean impression of foliage surrounding this water bowl, like so. A little bit too much foliage here, that's fine, you can always rub it out. And that's a very hand-rendered look of lots of foliage that was achieved simply by stenciling. I'm now going to put a few shrubs into the garden. So there is a shrub symbol, again one that I drew earlier. I'll choose black again and then plant some shrubs down in this bottom corner. So I can plant these of different sizes. Notice that in order to use these stencils I only need to tap once on the little paint bucket and that fills the stencils automatically without me actually having to stencil. And I've planted then a series of shrubs in that border, like so. All of those look very hand-rendered, but it took seconds to achieve. And there's one more bed here which needs to be filled with grasses. And so these, I'll just apply a separate layer for those, so again that I have control over those, that if we go to the stencils menu here, another grass that I've drawn, let's say this one here, and this time I'm going to fill this grass with colour immediately. So I can choose the colour here and actually plant these grasses in colour rather than in black and white, which produces a very different effect and works very nicely when you've got very fine filigree grass leaves like this, which would be very difficult to render otherwise. And so let's just come out of that and see what that looks like. So those are the grasses that have been drawn into that raised bed there. And that's probably enough just to give the impression of planting. We then need to add some colour. And so this water feature here, it's important that really that is filled in blue, so that at a glance that can be read as water. And so I'm using a watercolour brush here and deliberately coming off the page so that when I go back in, it creates a watercolour staining which looks very naturalistic and also looks rather more watery, like so. We can add a little bit more colour to the rest, particularly to the trees. How would I do that? The easiest way is with the roller brush, and also the most effective and attractive way, I think. So if we add an extra layer and make that extra layer go to multiply, that then means we can use the roller brush very effectively because the black of the trees themselves will not be affected by the colour that we're applying with the roller brush. And we can change the colour of the trees just to give a more interesting appearance to the finished design, like so. The shrubs as well would benefit from some colour, so we can move into the shrubs. And again, with the roller brush, it's very easy just to apply blocks of colour and really not to be too concerned about overlaps. That's really part of the look. The grasses, likewise. The grasses should be a nice sort of ochre colour here, and they can all be rendered at a single stroke using the roller brush, like so. These grasses here, although already coloured in green, could benefit perhaps from a little bit more colour, and so that can be done again with the roller brush, just to enhance them and to make them stand out rather better. One can of course go on adding colour, but what this garden is about is the planting, and so one could decide to leave it there, apart from the fact that I think it would probably really benefit from having a colour wash across the paving. Well, to fill in colour in large areas like this, the easiest way is to use the infill tool here, and I'm going to use a straight line selector. I've chosen a soft grey. The layering is set to multiply, which means that the black line work will come through very clearly. And I've also set the grey to quite a low transparency as well, so that it will just be a very soft colour that I'm using here. How to do that? Well, we need to touch the screen and draw a bead to that point. So that's where we need to get back to. So it's touch and drag. And then after that, we can simply touch these points going round the patio and round the house, because everywhere within these dots will in an instant be coloured. And so we take the paving to here and to here, and then back down to here, and then complete the area here by touching this circle. And that's all filled in. We then simply need to accept it by touching the paint pot, and we've rendered the whole of that grey. We can do the same with all the stepping stones in exactly the same technique, but using this time the rectangular selector, where we simply draw a rectangle round that paving and accept, and a rectangle round this paving like so, and then accept with the paint pot. So having filled in all the paving stones, which now of course make them far easier to read at a glance, you'll notice that some of these were filled in very quickly and they overlap this central fire pit. We want the fire pit to of course be looking as if it's above the paving, and so again this principle of drawing too much and then erasing after the event is the easiest way of working, because it's a very easy thing to clean up once you've drawn too much, because that's the way that digital infill works, and I've now instantly got a very clean line around there, and the paving stones are standing out very cleanly. Of course, you could look at that as I'm doing now and think that actually I've rather overdone it on the grey, it looks too dominant, but because it's on a separate layer, I can go into that layer and I can reduce the drawing opacity to something far softer and far gentler, which gives still a very clear impression of the paving and of the paving stones, but isn't anything like as harsh as it was previously. So again, rectangular selector, we rectangularly select like so, it fills the colour and I accept. I then do the same, approaching the rectangle from the other side and accept. And then the back of the bench, I can draw a rectangle like so and then accept. And so I've now colour rendered the bench, and it's now easy to read at a glance. The only other thing that I think I might do is the pergola and these pergola arches, so again they stand out rather more clearly. I can use exactly the same principle as I was using here and then delete. Let's do that for the pergola. I'll do the pergola in the same colour timber as I've done the bench. So it's then just a question of selecting out these rectangles and deleting. So you can see I can select and delete, and I do that a few more times and the whole pergola will be completely rendered. Having coloured in the pergola like that, so the pergola now stands out nicely, I'm going to do the same for these two arches here. There's one there and there's one there, so that it's visually clear at a glance. So again, the same process. Instant infill, rectangular tool here, and if I select that area there, it fills it in, I accept the colour, and then I do the same to this one, and I fill in and accept the colour. Now the idea of colour render like this is really just to make the plan easy to read at a glance, to make it readable, so we don't need to go on and on adding colour, as long as we can see at a glance what's happening here. And I think possibly the only thing that isn't instantly clear, unlike the water here, is the fire pit. So I'll just give a little bit of colour to the fire pit, just so that it reads as a fire pit. Now the interesting thing is that of course this started as a pen and ink drawing on a real piece of paper. So how will it look if it goes back onto that piece of paper? Let's see, if we send it to print, if we actually print it on a real piece of paper again, will it work as a colour render? So there we have it, printed back in the real world again, but fully rendered in Morpholio Trace.